Hey, so what's Preston Manning up to these days? I mean, besides promoting the carbon tax at Tides Foundation-funded events. Well, he recently sent out a fundraising letter to people to ask them for money to support his Manning Center for Building Democracy. Let me quote to you from near the top. He says that Alberta's recent provincial election was a disaster, and here's his comments on that. He says, what lessons can be learned from this election? 1, Conservatives don't always win, not even in Alberta. And number 2, good political training is important. Are those really the lessons in Alberta? I mean, the Jim Prentice's PC party wasn't conservative at all. They brought in the biggest spending, biggest taxing, biggest deficit budget in Alberta history. So to say that Conservatives don't always win, I suppose it's true, but Jim Prentice was no Conservative. But put that aside, the second point's even more interesting. Preston Manning is suggesting that the reason the NDP won and the PCs and the Wildrose lost is because of political training? Is that Preston's assessment of the election? Is that all this rabble that was elected to the NDP, people like Deborah Trevor, that wild child party girl, who's, if she's not smoking pot, was listening to terrible music and posing in strange poses. Does Preston Manning think that Deborah Trevor won her seat because of political training, but PCs and Wildrose candidates lost because of poor training? Is that the big takeaway? That's the lesson Preston Manning learned from the Alberta election. That's very strange to me. I think Preston should retire if that's what he thinks the big lessons are. But let's look at the second page of his fundraising letter. He says, whether we are talking about municipal, provincial, or federal politics, the problem is the same: a lack of training opportunities for candidates and grassroots supporters. Is that really the problem in Canada? Is that the problems Conservatives face, is they don't have training? How about they don't have principled leaders, Preston? I'm starting with you. First of all, abandoning oil and gas industry and conservative values and embracing a carbon tax. And if you actually look at what started the domino effect in Alberta, why Jim Prentice lost, while the Wildrose Party didn't do better, it was because of unprincipled leadership, including by Preston Manning himself. You'll recall that it was Preston Manning who advised Danielle Smith, the leader of the Wildrose Party, just to quit her party, dissolve it as best she could, and defect to Jim Prentice's PCs, giving him a clear field to jack up taxes and call a snap election. That's got nothing to do with training. That's got to do with ethics and character and conservative principle. And Preston Manning was at the heart of that. Preston Manning is trying to blame a lack of training for the loss in Alberta, when Preston Manning's own role in the defection and dissolution of the Wildrose Party is what precipitated that. If Stephen Harper loses the election this fall, and I hope he doesn't, it won't be because of lack of training. It'll be because of funding issues or the number of campaign volunteers on the other side or hostile media. It's got nothing to do with training, but I suppose when that's all Preston Manning is offering to sell, that's all he can fundraise on. I want to read one more point from his fundraising letter, and it's on his last page. He says he's looking for better timber in politics, for a better class of people to run. He says we can only do that if Canadians such as yourself are willing to make a financial sacrifice to fund the Manning School so that we can train and mentor the next generation of Conservatives. So Preston Manning is trying to sop up Conservative money for his Manning Center. What do they do at the Manning Center? Well, if you click through the Manning Center's Facebook pages, you'll find very quickly that the kind of training they do includes having Preston Manning's wife, Sandra, giving etiquette lessons to candidates on which fork to use what, which glass of wine, white wine, red wine, pairing with your meal. Do you think I'm kidding? Look at this photo essay that the Manning Center was so proud of. This is the kind of training they spend their donors' money on. Telling Conservatives, I guess, or really anyone who's just hungry for a free meal, on where to put your napkin and don't put your elbows on the table. Sandra Manning is running an etiquette class at the Manning School for Building Democracy, and someone's got to pay for all that vino. Look, I worked for Preston Manning about 20 odd years ago, and back then he was a grassroots conservative who would have been outraged that the Mulrooney conservatives thought that pairing your wines with your fish and your chicken was anything other than snobbery. The kind of people who know what wine goes with what meat were the kind of people who laughed at Preston Manning, made fun of his squeaky voice, made fun of his glasses, made fun of him being a yokel. I think what's going on here is that Preston Manning has gone fancy. He's gotten rich, he's gotten popular. And so the Preston Manning who 20 years ago knew that the carbon tax was unconservative, well, he's pro-carbon tax now because all the right people like him. The Preston Manning who 20 years ago would have laughed at a conservative organization teaching you what fork to use is now the one who hires his wife to put on that training session. Look, there are some good people who affiliate with Preston Manning either out of sentimental reasons or just not knowing any better. But these days we need true conservatives to fight for true conservative values. And Preston Manning, for him to comment on the Alberta election that he helped throw for conservatives, I think that shows he's dangerously out of touch and lacks any consciousness of the role he played in that socialist disaster. For TheRebel.media, I'm Ezra Levant.